To understand why the world is so obsessed with this tiny patch of ocean, you have to understand the brutal constraints of its geography. The Strait of HORMUZ is roughly 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. That sounds spacious until you look at the floor of the ocean. Because of shallow waters and treacherous reefs, the actual navigable shipping lanes, the deepwater highways, are only 2 miles wide in either direction. These lanes are separated by a mere 2-mile wide buffer zone. Imagine 20% of the world's total petroleum consumption squeezed through a narrow gap. There is no rerouting here. You cannot take a 200,000-ton vessel off-road. If a single tanker is scuttled, the entire conveyor belt grinds to a halt. The numbers are staggering. We are talking about an average of 21 million barrels of oil moving through this gate every single day. To put that in perspective, those barrels would stretch from New York City to London and back every 24 hours. This isn't just oil. It is the fuel for every flight, every cargo ship, and every delivery truck on the planet. Now, layer the geopolitics on top. On the northern coast, you have Iran, a nation that has perfected the art of asymmetrical naval warfare. They don't need a massive navy. They have hundreds of fast attack craft and sophisticated naval mines hidden in coastal silos. They have spent 40 years preparing for a close-the-door scenario. Opposing them is the United States Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain. It is a constant game of cat and mouse, where a single miscalculation by a junior commander could trigger a global depression. We've seen versions of this before, but the stakes have changed. During the tanker war of the 1980s, hundreds of ships were attacked. Yet the oil kept flowing because the weapons were relatively primitive. Today, we live in the era of precision-guided munitions and autonomous swarming drones. A modern conflict wouldn't just harass shipping, it would make the insurance premium so high that no commercial captain would dare enter the Gulf. Critics often point to the alternatives. They talk about the East-West pipeline in Saudi Arabia or the Habshan-Fujairah line in the United Arab Emirates. Let's debunk that myth right now. While these pipelines exist, their combined maximum capacity is less than 6 million barrels per day. That leaves a deficit of 15 million barrels. You cannot bridge a 15 million barrel per day gap with wishful thinking. Those pipelines are a small vent, not an alternative lung. If HORMUZ closes, the energy market doesn't just tighten, it breaks. And as the price of oil begins its vertical climb toward $120, the real damage begins to manifest in global agriculture. When the news cycle confirms a total blockage of the Strait of HORMUZ, the global oil market does not just react, it ruptures. To understand why prices would scream toward $120 a barrel, we have to look into the psychology of extreme scarcity. In the first 48 hours, the physical absence of oil is secondary to the panic of the paper markets. Oil is the most heavily traded commodity on Earth, underpinned by a massive web of futures, contracts, and derivatives. When 20 million barrels a day vanish, every airline and national government rushes to lock in whatever supply remains. This creates a vertical price move. In the short term, the world cannot simply stop consuming oil. Your local trucking fleet cannot switch to electricity overnight. A chemical plant cannot just turn off its boilers. Because demand cannot drop as fast as supply, the price is forced to do all the heavy lifting. As Brent crude crosses the $100 mark, we enter the realm of the derivative cascade and massive margin calls. This creates a feedback loop, a short squeeze of global proportions that detaches the price from reality. The real pain isn't just in a spreadsheet, it's in the physical movement of goods. This is where the macroeconomic contagion begins. Diesel is the silent engine of civilization. It moves the tractors that plant the seeds and the trucks that carry the harvest. When diesel prices double, the inflationary tax is applied to every item. The energy cost is baked into the final price. This leads us to the impossible dilemma of the world's central banks, like the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank. If you raise interest rates into a supply shock, you are actively crushing the consumer who is already struggling for gas and groceries. This is the definition of stagflation, stagnant economic growth coupled with high inflation. It is the worst-case scenario. Now, some might point to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or the SPR, as a safety net. However, the SPR is a tactical tool, not a structural solution. It would only cover 5% of the hole left by the strait. If the closure persists, the price of oil doesn't just stay at 120. It looks for a new, much higher ceiling. We also have to consider the acyclic capex cycle. The world is in a massive investment into artificial intelligence and defense. These sectors are incredibly energy intensive. From GPU data centers to fuel-hungry logistics, the floor for demand is higher than ever. The world is locked into high energy consumption, making the $120 price point incredibly sticky. As crude oil rewrites the rules of finance, a more dangerous clock begins to tick. The same strait carries the fuel for the world's food supply. To understand why your dinner is about to get much more expensive, we look past oil toward the LNG terminals of Qatar. While the world focuses on the chaos of $120 oil, a far more silent and deadly crisis is unfolding. In the chemical plants of the Persian Gulf, a 32% fertilizer spike is being fueled by the crisis in liquefied natural gas. Qatar is an energy powerhouse that rivals the largest oil producers, but its primary export is gas, not just oil. Roughly 20% of the global liquefied natural gas trade passes through the same 2-mile wide shipping lanes of the Strait of HORMUZ. When the strait is blocked, the global gas market doesn't just tighten, it goes into a state of total cardiac arrest. Natural gas is not merely a fuel for heating homes, it is the fundamental feedstock for the Haber-Bosch process. This process is the method by which we pull nitrogen out of the air and turn it into a form that plants can eat. The Haber-Bosch process uses natural gas to provide hydrogen and the energy required to break inert nitrogen bonds under extreme heat. This creates anhydrous ammonia, the base of all nitrogen-based fertilizers like urea and ammonium nitrate used in global agriculture. Experts estimate that nearly 50% of the world's population is alive today only because of this specific chemical reaction. Without synthetic nitrogen, global crop yields would collapse by half. Now consider the math of the current crisis. Natural gas accounts for 80% of the cost of producing nitrogen fertilizer. When supply is cut, benchmark prices skyrocket. Following the start of the blockade, urea prices have already surged by over 28% according to recent data. Analysts project a minimum 32% increase as Middle Eastern sulfur, a critical component for phosphate fertilizers, is also choked off. Farmers in the United States, heartland, Brazil, and across Europe are facing a brutal reality as they begin the spring planting season. When fertilizer costs spike, farmers have two choices: pay the premium and raise food prices, or apply less fertilizer. Paying the premium triggers a secondary wave of food inflation that hits the grocery store months after the energy crisis began. Underapplication leads to yield destruction. A 32% cost increase often results in a 10 to 15% drop in harvest volume. Unlike the oil market, the production of high-grade urea is incredibly concentrated in the Gulf. Oman is the second largest exporter. India alone imports over $7 billion worth of fertilizer annually, much of it transiting through the Strait of HORMUZ. For a nation of 1.4 billion people, this isn't an economic statistic. It is a national security emergency. This is the hidden domino. A naval blockade leads to gas price surges, which breaks the economics of the Haber-Bosch process. Suddenly, a conflict in the Middle East dictates the caloric intake of a family in sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia. $120 oil and the 32% fertilizer spike are the twin jaws of a trap closing on emerging markets. As the clock ticks into late March 26, we are witnessing the emergence of a triple threat that is systematically dismantling the stability of the global South. For emerging markets like Pakistan, Egypt, and Sri Lanka, the closure of the Strait of HORMUZ is not a market fluctuation. It is an existential crisis. These nations are being hit by three simultaneous waves that their fragile balance sheets simply cannot absorb. The first wave is the immediate import bill. And when oil hits $120 and natural gas benchmarks double, the foreign exchange reserves evaporate. Pakistan, which relies on the Gulf for 80% of its energy, is already facing a depletion of its diesel and petrol reserves. This triggers the second wave, the dominoes of default. As energy costs soar, the value of local currencies collapses against a dominant United States dollar. Suddenly, the dollar-denominated debt these countries took on years ago becomes unpayable. In just 3 weeks, we have seen bond spreads for nations like Jordan and Uzbekistan widen to distressed levels, signaling a wave of sovereign defaults. The third and most devastating wave is the agricultural fallout. We are currently in the peak spring planting season for the Northern Hemisphere. With Russia suspending exports and China implementing bans on fertilizer blends, the global South is being frozen out. When a 32% fertilizer spike meets a collapsing local currency, the result is yield destruction and acute food insecurity. This chaos is driving a radical geopolitical realignment. As Western-led maritime security fails, we see a shift toward resource nationalism. Countries in Africa and Southeast Asia are increasingly looking toward Moscow and Beijing, not for ideology, but for survival. Russia is leveraging its position as the world's largest fertilizer exporter to secure new dependencies, while the rest of the world starves. We are moving into a fragmented world of security-led ordering, where the ability to grow food is the only true currency of power. The crisis of 26 has exposed a terrifying truth. Our modern civilization is a hyper-optimized machine resting on a razor's edge. The Strait of Hormuz is the ultimate single point of failure. A 2-mile-wide shipping lane dictates global prices and local survival. $120 oil and a fertilizer spike are not just numbers, they are the mathematical certainties of a world that traded resilience for efficiency. As we move forward, the question is how we will rebuild a global system that isn't one blockade away from collapse. The era of cheap energy and easy food is over. The era of strategic survival has begun.